2.
This is Novel Marketing.
I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr.
I'm James L. Rubart.
And this is the show for novelists who want to become best-selling authors.
And in this episode, we are going to talk about the major mistakes you might be making with your name.
Yes, when it comes to marketing, your name is one of the biggest, most important elements of your marketing, and sometimes we make mistakes with our name. You wouldn't know anything about this, James L. Rubart, or Jim Rubart, or is it Jim L. Rubart, or what was your name again?
Where do I buy your books? Who are you? Oh my gosh. So when I got my first, I won't give you the long boring history, but basically I'm James Lee Rubart on my birth certificate. Between the time of 0 and 8, I was Jamie Rubart. At 8 to, now, I'm Jim Rubart. But when I got my first contract, I was trying to decide, what do I put on my books? Jim doesn't sound sophisticated enough. And there's this TV writer, James L. Brooks, and I'd always liked his name. And so I'm James Lee Rubart. I'll be James L. Rubart. And so I put that on my books, and I decided to use that. That's why I chose it. It was not a great choice. And so what we want to do in this episode is talk to you about why it wasn't a great choice and help you to avoid doing some of the same things. So let's dive into it.
So what happened? What's the worst thing that happened? You put James L. Rubart on your book and everyone just calls you James after that, right?
Right, just automatically. All my friends start calling me James, and in public people call me James. And the problem is so many people, I was already fairly well connected at that point before the books came out. And so everyone still knew me as Jim. And so they called me Jim. But it's James on the books. And that is a disconnect. And you'd think, well, how can that be a disconnect? I kid you not, that is a disconnect. I have been on Facebook pages where someone will all comment as Jim Rubart, and other people will comment that I don't know and go, oh my gosh, Jim Rubart. I wonder if that's any relation to James L. Rubart. That is a problem when you're trying to get your name out there. And to put it in perspective, if I said, hey, there's this author that has written this amazing book called On Writing for novelists named Stephen King, and then along somebody comes and he posts and says, I'm Steve King. Can you see how you might go, Stephen King. Yeah, well, wouldn't that be funny if they were, there was some relation? Well, it's the same person. And that's what started happening to me and is still happening to me. The other problem is the initial. I thought James L. Rubart. I thought that would be cool. But what happens is people take out the L and they just say it's James Rubart when they're introducing me, or I'm on a radio show. I did this conference a number of years ago, and the conference director did something that was so cool. She took quotes from each of the speakers and put it on canvas and put it up on stage when we arrived. And we didn't know this was going to be done. It's the coolest thing in the world. But I look up at my name at the top and it's James Rubart. There's no L, and of course I'm not going to say anything. But that's when I started to realize, oh my gosh, you've got a little bit of a liability here.
And this is very common where things are reduced. So I made a deal with my dad. He's Tom Umstattd, and I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr. So, in fact, he sometimes uses the G. So he's Tom G. Umstattd, and I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr., and that's how we separate. So I introduce myself here, and I put in the junior. No one ever includes the junior. So there are things that are included, and if you want to include an initial, there is a way to do it. And that's what we're not just going to talk about what not to do. We're also going to tell you what to do.
Yep.
So if you really want initials, there's a way to do it, and that is to have more than one. So C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien. If you have more than one initial and no other name, then you can get away with initials. But when you insert just a single initial, people see it as optional, just like they see a junior is optional. And it's not just me. Martin Luther King Jr., most people just call him Martin Luther King. The junior gets left off more often than not with him as well. And he's probably the most famous of all of the juniors. He got to the top of the pile. And so if it's going to get left off from him, it's probably going to get left off from you. So what I recommend, if you have a very common name, is to have a middle name rather than a middle initial. Because if it was James Lee Rubart, suddenly it would have that strength to it and people wouldn't drop off the Lee.
Yep.
There's all kinds of three named authors. Orson Scott Card.
James Scott Bell is an example.
Scott Bell, yeah. So lots of different three name options to go with. But This is really important because if you are different in different places, people can't find you. And if they can't find you, they can't read you and they can't share you with others. And it's just a bad name is like a boat anchor on your marketing.
And again, back to the earlier point, we don't think it's a disconnect if the name is slightly off, but it is. For that person who has gotten to know you one way, it is a complete disconnect to the point that they think you are different people. So what should people call you? I would encourage you to start with what people call you. In other words, if you're known as Jim Rubart, then be Jim Rubart on your books. If you're known as Sally Jones, then don't try to be Sally A. Jones. Be Sally Jones. Stay with what you've already built up to be your circle of influence, even if it's a small circle of influence.
Or go with something entirely different. So if you're going to go, if let's say Sally Jones is taken and you don't want to be Sally Jones for whatever reason, pick an entirely different name so it's very obvious that it's a pen name and people won't confuse it. It's when it's very similar is where you get into trouble.
So what if you have a common name? Because we get this question a lot. What if Sally Jones is your name and sallyjones.com and .net and .org, they're all taken. You can do that, what Thomas just said, have a different last name that's radically different. You can do a pseudonym. You can put a middle name in there. If you're female and married, you can use a maiden name. There are lots of different avenues you can go down. One of the things, I have a friend that needs to get a website, and I said, and he's got a fairly common first and last name. And I said, well, who has it now? He says, well, this guy's got it. Has he done anything with it? No, he hasn't done anything with it for 5 years. There's been like 2 posts in 5 years. It's like, man, call him up, email, get a hold of him and say, I would like to buy the domain name. So don't think just because it's taken that there's no chance to get a hold of it. There is a chance.
Yeah, I wanted to buy umstattd.com so that my political enemies couldn't get it at some point in the future and set up an attack site. And it was owned by somebody in India who I think was just squatting on the domain name. I don't know. And he was like $5,000. And I was like, I can't do 5,000. So we kept we negotiated for like 9 months. And eventually I ended up buying it for, I think, $300 or $400, maybe $250 to buy umstattd.com. I'm not using it for anything. I just bought it to keep it safe. But you can buy domains from other folks. A lot of people will not, they just think domain should only be $10. But sometimes for a few $100s, you can get a really solid domain name. That's how we got authormedia.com. We bought it from somebody else who owned it, and it was not a cheap domain, but it was so much better than umstattmedia.com, which no one can spell Umstattd. So here's the deal. There's no perfect name.
Right.
So there's a continuum. There is more likely to be unique to you, which is also harder to spell. And then there is less likely to be unique to you, which is easier to spell. Almost never are you going to get a name that's easy to spell and is unique to you. Now,
and sometimes it can be a bonus. Don't you think, Thomas? I mean, like Rubart, that's, oh my gosh, Rupert, Robert, Robart. I get every variation because Rubart is an unusual name. At the same time, once you get it in your head, Rubart, you don't forget it because it is unusual. Same thing with Umstattd. When Arnold Schwarzenegger first came out, and you can go to IMDb and look this up. It's kind of interesting. His first screen role, his name in the movie is Arnold Strong, right? Which makes sense based on he's playing this, bodybuilder type guy. But then he said, no, my name's Schwarzenegger. I don't care if they can't spell it. That's who I'm going to be. And now we all know that name. It's an unusual name. So even if you have an unusual name like Thomas and I, it can ultimately end up being an advantage for you.
Now, as you're brainstorming options, whether you're going to go with your first 2 initials in your last name or your first name, last name, or first, middle, last name, there's a great website that's free called namecheck.com, except it's name CHK. The E is missing because it's 2017 and we don't put all the vowels in our websites anymore. Which don't do that, by the way. Keep your name spelled correctly. But NameCheck will look your name up to see if the .com is available. It'll check it on Facebook and on Twitter and on like 100 other services. So as you're brainstorming names, you can check it on those things. And it'll have links if somebody else owns it. You can check and see how strong a name. Because just because there's another Joe Blow out there, you could be the Joe Blow to rule them all. With good enough marketing and enough noise, you're the one that they're all wishing that they had a different name so they're not confused with you. So just because somebody else has your name doesn't mean you need to just give up and go home. You can beat out the other folks if put into practice the things you're listening to on this show, and you'll have a good chance to win. Good search engine optimization, good sales, and suddenly you're at the top of the stack when someone Googles for your name.
A couple other things to think about, and one of them is if you say, nope, they already have the name, I want to keep my name, and so I'm going to be James L. Rubart Books or JamesLRubartNovels.com. I've seen this a lot on websites. I've seen this a lot on Facebook, and at first it sounds like a good idea. But back to Thomas's earlier point, the problem is what happens is the people drop off the novels, they drop off the books, and they end up still searching for you without that extension, and it gets you in the same pot of water.
Unless you're able to have strong enough search engine optimization where you at least rank when they do a search. You can still make it work with books or whatever at the end, but it does make it harder if the person with your exact match it has an active website. It'd be very hard to get number one. Now, you could also buy it, pay 5 cents a click to rank number one on Google. But again, for those of you who are yet to be published, this is for you because you have the opportunity to pick a good name that you don't have to fight for, and you're not having to pull out your broadsword and beat down, send somebody to go get the domain from somebody who's died or whatever. You can do it much easier by just picking a strong name that's unique. And for most people, first, middle, last is going to be available. And so as we have a proliferation of authors, what we're going to see is a proliferation of 3-name and 4-name authors.
And hear us correctly on this. We are advocates for using your real name because that's who you are. We are just giving you alternatives and things to think about when you lock that name down. One other thing to think about is the radio test. So if I say, hey, today we're interviewing author Thomas Brown, or we're interviewing author or James Brown. Ooh, James Brown. So if I'm listening to a radio interview, and hey, today we're talking with James Brown or Thomas Brown, how do you spell that last name? Think about it. Most people would say Brown. What if there's an E on your name? What if it's Green with an E? Then what do you do? So you have to think through this. It's not just if that name's available. Think about how it applies in every situation: radio, TV, print, conversation. Oh my gosh, I just read this great book by Thomas Brown. You got to get it. You got to think about through all those different scenarios when you're picking that name.
Now, there's one thing you can do with the radio test to help fix this, and that is to buy common misspellings. So Umstattd, a common misspelling, is just with a T at the end. So if I was concerned about people mistyping it, I could buy Thomas Umstattd without any of the extra German consonants that are kind of hanging out at the end of the name for no apparent purpose, and have it redirect to my main website.
Great idea.
The other thing is just to have good SEO. So if you're not sure how to spell Umstattd, if you type in Thomas and just get started, by the time you hit the UMS, Google will suggest the rest of the spelling because enough people have Googled my name that I'm now the result there. And so again, with good enough SEO, you can make any name work. But I've had a $5 prize for anyone who could spell Umstattd correctly the first time, and that prize has gone unclaimed for like 15 years. People hadn't seen it spelled it correctly. So no one ever gets it. Like, you're not going to be able to spell Umstattd because it's two languages like fought and like combined and clashed in one name.
I've spelled your name probably. I'm getting probably in the mid 200s, and I still can't do it.
So the other things to look at is if your name is available on Twitter and on LinkedIn and on Facebook. And again, namecheck.com, namechk.com. We'll look it up on all of those different places.
But this is a big deal, Thomas. You're absolutely right to look that up because Thomas and I work with authors where it's one thing on their Facebook page, one thing else, something else on Twitter, something else on their email address. It's all these different proliferations of their name, and there's no consistency. You really need to have consistency across. It's not just your website.
And if it's taken,
across all platforms. Yeah,
and if it's taken, consider being the real Thomas Umstattd to make it look like it's a fan page that's running the other one. There's a few famous people who have names along those same sorts of lines.
Anybody we've ever heard of?
I'm not going to name it. We already talked about him last episode, which is one episode too many. So, sorry, I don't want to get political. Even that is political. Save me, Jim. This is a marketing show, not a political show.
That's right. Hey, we this episode is sponsored by the same sponsor we've had for a few times now, and that's Thomas's and my own course, the 5-year plan to becoming a bestseller author, or as we like to say, the 5-year plan to becoming an overnight success. And essentially what this is it is a blueprint. It is the steps you need to take to become a best-selling author. And the guarantee, you've heard of what it is, immediate money-back guarantee. If you get into it and go, nope, this isn't working for me, your money back. But also at the end of the course, if you are not a best-selling author, we'll give you your money back. And really, it's not expensive, not an expensive course to get into. If you want to know more, the easiest thing to do is to go to novelmarketing.com, and there's a button there in the upper right, and you can click on that, and that'll give you all the details.
And it doesn't just have training, it also has encouragement. So if you've ever felt discouraged, we've crafted this to help you get back into the game and be more energetic and motivated than you've ever been before with your writing.
Yes.
So if you've ever found these episodes, these radio episodes or podcast episodes encouraging, the 5-year plan is even more encouraging than that. So do check it out at novelmarketing.com.
You've been listening to James L. Rubart and Thomas Umstattd Jr., some of the most difficult names to spell in the world, on the Novel Marketing Podcast, giving you novel ideas on how to promote yourself and your writing, offline, online, and everywhere in between. Thanks for listening.